Thanks very much for coming to our San Francisco IGDA event here at Dolby. I'd like to first of all thank our sponsors, Autodesk, Fantasy Studios, Crystal Dynamics, and of course Dolby, who have provided this awesome space and are also providing the refreshments afterwards. And if you don't know, Lori is the Dolby representative here, and so you have her to thank for the food and the wonderful space. So, and you all have to do that. So, also our organizers, Tim, Michael, Malky, Brian, and Jordan, without which this event would not be possible. And I don't know if you guys, how often you guys come to our events, but we're starting to have events much more frequently, and that's due in part by our other location in Autodesk, and that's a big help from Michael, who's been organizing that. Yeah, and thank you. You should have started slower. Yeah, if you guys don't know, those events are posted everywhere, and maybe actually Michael did this last time. Just a show of hands. How do you guys find out about us? Who here is from the meetup group? Okay. And who is from the Google group? Oh my God.
No one knows about the Google group.
Who's here? Facebook? Our Facebook.
Has the mailing list turned into the Google group?
Yeah, the mailing list is the
Google group.
Yes. Yeah, the mailing list is the Google group. Okay. Okay. So from everywhere. And if you guys have any ideas of where else we should be, let us know, because it's good having you guys here. We've got some upcoming events. We're hopefully going to have our next event in October, although I'm not confirming that yet. But the next event from our sister chapter.
We're sisters.
We're sisters now. And it's my first time. Sorry, Simon from the IGDA Silicon Valley chapter is here to let you know about their upcoming event.
Yep. So I'm here to pimp our event. So we're doing an event at Google called Meet the Press. It's next Tuesday, and it's down on Google's campus. So actually, a lot of you raised your hand saying that you were on the meetup group, and that's the same meetup group for San Francisco, Silicon Valley. So you can find it on there. Basically, the idea is we've got a bunch of journalists like Wired Magazine, IGN. I don't know, there's 5 of them. They're all top journalists and everything from the who are reporting on the game industry. And the idea is to get them in front of you guys and have them talk about what they're doing, what they like to write stories about, how they like to be approached, all those kinds of things. And I think unless you are sort of like a seasoned PR professional, I've been talking to these guys as we've been leading up to doing the panel, and I'd be really surprised if everybody doesn't come away from the thing with a lot of actually really usable information as to what you can do to get your company or your game or whatever it is a better shot at getting some press written about it, sort of thing. So come to the event. There's free beer. I should mention that. I was clapping before. Hope to see you guys down there. If you're not on the meetup group, meetpress.eventbrite.com, and you can find it that way too. Thanks.
Awesome. So now, without further ado, this is a topic that I think is really great for the environment that we're in these days with the consoles and the life cycle where they're at, and who knows where that's going. Narrative is something that really interests me. It's certainly something that we've talked a lot about in our studio, and I'm very excited to present to you Kent Hudson.
Yeah, thanks for coming. I originally gave this talk at GDC this year. Also, sorry for sort of standing so far off the side, but the way this is set up to be able to see my laptop, that's kind of how it's going to be. And also, this will please Yonaman very much to hear, but I upgraded to Lion recently. Maybe could have been tested a little bit more before Apple released it, and so Keynote in particular has trouble with it. So we might see some crashes, some beach balls. I don't know. So it'll be an adventure for all of us. But anyways, yeah, my name is Kent. Thanks for coming. That link right there is the slides already up on there, and there's annotated versions and everything. So don't feel the need to take 2 copies of notes. Don't worry about that. And the link is also on the last slide, so you'll get it again if you stay till the end. Quick bit about me. I started my career at Ion Storm Austin, where I worked on Deus Ex Invisible War, the PlayStation 2 port of Deus Ex, and helped out some on Thief 3. And after Ion Storm collapsed, I went to Midway and worked on was creative director on an open world action game that also got canceled when Midway collapsed. And so after that, I moved to 2K Marin, where I worked on Bioshock 2 and also worked on the new XCOM project for a while. And I recently left there and have come to LucasArts, where I am working on a new project with Clint Hocking and Matthias Bork, who's way in the back. And I might have possibly said his name right. Kind of weird Roman questions, his last name that I never quite get. So anyways, quick spoiler alert, it's a talk about stories, and I'm going to talk about some story events from a couple games. Red Dead Redemption, Morrowind, Deus Ex, Passage, and Portal. So if you have not played any of these games and don't want the story spoiled, then maybe cover your ears when those slides come up. There will be ample warning, but just to let you know, I will be talking about the stories from those games. So you're warned. So quick little roadmap. I'm going to talk about the problem as I see it with story in games right now, put forth a goal that I hope we can start to achieve, and then talk about some stumbling blocks on the way to achieving that goal, and then look at some possible solutions along with analysis of how some existing games have dealt with these kind of issues, and then of course a little wrap up at the end. So to dive right in, the problem, in my opinion, and obviously this is just me talking here, but I really get disappointed by games that have super scripted linear narratives that don't give the player a lot of agency at the narrative layer of the game, and basically everybody kind of has the same experience, and you're sort of just living to get to the next trigger and watch the next cutscene and that kind of thing. That really bothers me, it bothers me not only because it's not my personal taste in games, but also because our medium has the ability to do a lot more than that, obviously, because we have the interactivity that other mediums don't have, and I feel like we're often wasting it and sort of telling stories that would be better told in other mediums, novels or films or any other linear medium like that. So I'd really like us to move more towards interactive narratives. And in addition to just the linear nature of most game stories, another thing that really bothers me is how what you do in gameplay is so different from what you do in cutscenes a lot of the time. You sort of kill strangers in gameplay and then fall in love in a cutscene. That's a really sort of dialed to 11 version of the problem. But basically, there's a big disconnect between what you're doing as a player and then what the character who you're playing is doing. And you're not really driving the story. You're sort of playing this little puppet who is actually driving the story in the game. So, again, we have a unique ability in our industry to let players tell more interesting stories, and stories are more personal to them. So this talk is about how we can achieve that. So the goal that I put forth here is player-driven stories, which I define as a story in which the player makes influential decisions that create a unique narrative that's not prescribed by a designer. I want to highlight a couple words here. The first one is influential decisions, which basically means the choices you're making actually matter to the narrative of the game. They're not cosmetic, they're not short loops that as soon as you make the decision, the game kind of collapses back to the same thread and moves forward. It's actually decisions that fundamentally change what goes on in the story. The second one is create, which basically means that you're not necessarily choosing branches because that's a series of predefined linear paths, but you're actually generating new story events and the game is reacting to what you're doing. You're actually creating a new context for the story with how you play. And the last one is narrative. Seems a little weird to underline that, but it is important that if we start moving towards this kind of game, that the decisions and reactions of the game actually do form into a real narrative, something that makes sense over time and has the rising and falling action that we recognize as a story, and actually comes together as a series of events that mean something over time to players. Now this is very, very hard, and I've actually been exploring this a lot since GDC, and have come to realize that it's actually a wicked problem. And that's a technical term, believe it or not. That's actually defined as a certain thing, which basically is a highly, highly complex problem that's so difficult to understand that there's no way to tell if you've ever solved it, because all solutions are unique. All solutions can only be measured against one another as better or worse than a different solution. There's literally no way to tell the right solution. And since everyone is unique, the way you solve the problem defines what the problem is. It's almost like a weird paradox in your head. It's incredibly complex. Examples of this are things like the Middle East crisis, or mass transit for a city, or the U.S. economy, where it's like, well, number of jobs, but then inflation does this, and then if people's health keeps them out of their job, and there's so many factors that you can't possibly know that you've ever solved it. So that's kind of scary, but it's still worth trying, and the nice thing is, if every solution is unique, then no one can say that you failed, because, of course, you can't say that you succeeded either, but it's still something worth trying. So anyways, if we're going to try to create these type of stories where the player, can make these meaningful decisions, to me it makes sense to start to look at, like, what do people want? What's satisfying to people? What gives people happiness? What are people looking for? And so when I started to research this, I found a scientific theory called self-determination theory, which is basically a theory that I think started in the 70s, and it's one of the most successful theories. Kind of replaced Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and which is the triangle of basic needs, physical needs, blah blah blah, that you probably learned in high school. This theory's actually been validated independently many times, and is actually a very well regarded theory in science. And what it basically says is that when it comes to happiness, people want three key things. They want autonomy, they want competence, and they want relatedness. The first one, autonomy, is what it sounds like. It's being a causal agent in your environment. It's being able to make decisions that actually matter, as opposed to decisions that don't matter, or not being able to make decisions. For the purpose of this talk, I'm actually going to change that and refer to it as agency, which is a game term that we're probably more familiar with, but it means the same thing. So if you hear me saying agency, I'm really talking about that concept of autonomy from self-determination theory. The second one is competence, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's being good at something, being able to have your actions, have skill with them and be intentional with them and allow them to actually make a difference. And it's something games do very well in core gameplay. Obviously, there's a lot of player skill in competitive games and whatnot, but not something that really has any effect on story. Like, you're rarely good at the story of a game. And the final one is relatedness, which again is exactly what it sounds like. It's having relationships. It's a pretty basic human need, caring about others, knowing others, and basically not being an island. And again, in the story of games, there's often a lot of relatedness. You have rich relationships with other characters, but in gameplay, that generally, at least in single-player games, obviously in multiplayer you can develop a lot more because that's another human being, but in single-player games you often have a lack of relatedness in the gameplay. So remember those words. You'll hear them a lot as we come back through the presentation. So with that in mind, let's take a look at the goal again and see where these plug in. Influential decisions and agency, those map very nicely because it basically means the decisions you make actually matter and actually change the world. Competence and create also go together very nicely because it basically means that your competence in the game, hopefully we could create stories where your competence is what actually creates the events. Like, if you are good at the game, it's actually creating a new narrative and your competence becomes an integral part of the story. And the final one is relatedness, which stories are about relationships with people. You can have stories with only one character, but generally stories do have a key hinging on people having strong relationships and how those relationships change over time. So to talk about agency first, and specifically the problem of disparate agency. This is what I touched on a little bit earlier, where basically you've got you and then the character in the game, and it's the idea that what you can do in a game is often a pale shadow of what the character you're playing can do in a game. And you generally, as a player, have a lot less agency than the character you're playing, and that's sort of a subtle way of the game saying the really important stuff is what you find in the narrative, where the really rich, compelling, emotional material is. And you're kind of, if you can keep this puppet alive long enough, the next cutscene will give you the good stuff. But as a player, you're kind of almost disrespected in a way because what you're doing is less important to the game than what the prescribed narrative says. So this is kind of a representation of that problem where you kind of have a subset of the character's agency. And if you look at that, it kind of makes sense that we would want to create situations where the player and the character have the same level of agency, which is basically allowing the player to affect all the different levels of the game, including the mid and high level narrative type stuff, and creating mechanics that then enable dynamics. If you're talking about the MDA framework of mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, mechanics and dynamics that allow those rich story emotions to come into play in the gameplay as opposed to the cutscenes. So if you want to make a game about loss or heartbreak or sadness or happiness or joy or triumph, design your mechanics and your dynamics in a way that enables those things to happen through what the player's doing. And don't worry, I'll go into a lot more detail on this later. So basically the player needs to speak the language of the narrative with his gameplay, and those things need to be a lot more unified. So a quick example of something, a game that did something interesting in this regard is Morrowind, and specifically Caius Cosades. I never know if I'm saying that right. But he's basically the main quest giver of the game. He's the guy who, in the beginning of the game, gives you all your missions and is the sort of critical story character of the game. And the cool thing about Morrowind is your agency in this game is so high, you can actually kill him. And if you do kill him, it pops up this little message that says, with this character's death, the thread of prophecy is severed. Restore a save game to restore the weave of fate or persist in the doomed world that you've created. Which is kind of harsh, but it's also kind of cool because the game goes on after this point. I think of this as like a narrative accessibility feature because it's basically saying, like, hey, you broke the main story, that's fine, you can keep playing. We just want you to know you can't do the main storyline, but it's your game, you can keep playing, we just want to let you know, which is really cool. But unfortunately, it does actually just sever the main quest of the game. The game doesn't fully react to that. It lets you know that you have a lot of agency, but it doesn't react to that fully. And so if you play from that point on, you kind of just have to make your own story in the game, and it's a lot less rich than what the main narrative of the game gives you. But so it's sort of like a half step towards a player-driven story because it does tolerate your actions, but it doesn't fully roll with them. And it's a little interesting to think about that, why Morrowind didn't take that further, because, for example, the game is very based on text, which is a lot cheaper, obviously, than VO and lip syncing and all the expensive ways that we normally tell stories. It has extensive verbs players can customize. It has verbs that are similar to what the enemies in the game have, and it seems like it was a really ripe setting for them to create a true player-driven story. But ultimately, they didn't, and that's unfortunate. And so I started thinking about why that was the case. And in Morrowind, when you kill the main quest giver, it's actually a pretty goofy scene. It's not a cool cut scene. The combat's pretty bad in Morrowind, actually, even though I love the game. It's pretty poor. And it's goofy, and so you might say, well, yeah, it'd be really cool if you strike him down and it's like 300 and you stab him or whatever. But actually, the fact that you can do it allows you to feel a lot more strongly about it than if you watched it in a cutscene. So in a weird way, players will put a lot of themselves into systemic interactions, and even if they don't have a high degree of polish, it will mean more to the player himself because that was what he did. It's their story now. It's their memories that they're creating, and they feel like the game's actually reacting to them. So I wouldn't necessarily get caught up on the fidelity problems. And in fact, the next thing I want to talk about is what's preventing us from creating this unified agency, this type of situation. And by the way, there's lots of good GDC talks about emergence and player autonomy and player expression that talk about the reasons why it means a lot to players for their decisions to matter, even if the presentation quality isn't near as high as what we're used to in a Call of Duty or a Mass Effect or something like that. But hold that thought, and I want to talk about why, in my opinion, we have a hard time, allowing the player more agency in games, and that's the idea of chasing reality. And this is a scene from Splinter Cell Conviction. It's the opening scene, and on many levels, it's amazing. The graphical fidelity is unbelievable. You're interrogating this guy. You can smash his head on the mirror and break the mirror and smash his head in the urinal. And there's a guy in the bathroom. If you bust the stall door open, he's like, get out of here, dude. And it's a very high fidelity, cool scene, but it also has exactly one outcome. And I started thinking about that, and it's like, well, it has one outcome because it took so much work to make the one scene play out the one way. And so I started thinking of fidelity as sort of the enemy of agency, really, because the more you chase that idea of fidelity, the more you're limited by your manpower, by your schedule, by your budget, all those other things, and you start to get to a point where you're very limited by practical realities, and you're kind of chasing something that might not matter as much as you think to players. And even when you're doing branching stories, you're still limited by, you can only create a finite number of branches, again, based on your, the manpower you have at your studio. So, put simply, as fidelity goes up, agency tends to decline. Another example that actually came out since GDC is LA Noire, which has some of the most realistic humans in the game, but that story plays out one way. And if you it's a series of branching. A friend of mine said you could actually make that game on a laser disc because it's simply just like everything just comes to a choice and right or wrong, through the game. And the reason it shipped on 3 discs on the CD or on the 360 is because they're just playing back reams and reams of animation. It looks great, but you have nothing to do with that game. The game barely needs you, and it's kind of sad. So, like I mentioned before, players are willing to trade off a significant amount of fidelity for agency. They're willing to, if you look at something like Minecraft, obviously not nearly as much, graphical power as a Call of Duty type game, but players are so much more expressive in that game, and they make their own worlds and come up with all kinds of creative things that the creators never thought of, and it's so cool. So let's break down what goes into a cutscene. And I use cutscene as a stand-in for like highly scripted events or QTEs or any kind of really, really high fidelity single path gameplay interaction. But cutscene's sort of the disaster case of that because you put the controller down. Like the game doesn't need you for those. So agency kind of goes out the window with cutscenes. So cutscenes are comprised of VO, custom writing, environments, modeling, and animation. Very broad strokes, but I'm picking these examples out. And basically the idea is that you don't have to take every one of these to 100 or dial it to 11 to get an emotional response from the player. And I started thinking about what's an example of something that shows a really emotional, powerful gaming experience that did not have amazing work in all of these realms. And I thought of the game Passage, which is a really, really cool game. Has anybody played Passage? Show of hands. Like, sweet. Half the room is awesome. So Passage is a very, very simple game. It's a 5-minute game. It takes, it's one button. You move. That's all you can do is move around in the game. And to me personally, it was more emotionally impactful than any sort of AAA game I've played since I can remember. It's a very deep and moving game. I know people who have cried playing it for 5 minutes. So it's a beautiful game, and I'll kind of walk you through how it works. So it's simply a game about life, and this is the whole thing. This is the entire game. And your only verb is movement, and so you're this guy on the left, and you start at the beginning of your life. Those are, I think it's the number of steps is in the top right, but it basically measures the length of your life. And you start on the left side of the screen, and all you can do is move, and you have this very limited view of the world. You can go up and down, but your view never gets wider than that little strip. And as you can see, one interesting thing they do, and this is a great example of expressing sort of emotional content through mechanics, is that on the right side of the screen it gets really, really garbled. That's actually the whole game world compressed into smaller and smaller space, and that kind of signifies to you the future is uncertain. The further out you get, the less you know what's going to happen, and it kind of symbolizes something we all struggle with, which is where am I going in life? What does my future hold? What path am I on? And so you just start walking through the game. You start on the left and you start walking, and eventually you meet a girl. And, again, movement's your only verb, so if you want to meet her, you walk up to her, and a little heart comes up, and she becomes your companion, which, by the way, is a little taste of relatedness, one of the, key tenets of self-determination theory. And so you start going through the world with this girl, and she's your wife, girlfriend, partner, whatever you want to call it. And as you start to go through the game, you start shifting across the screen, sort of from the present to the future, and this starts to move into the past. And you notice as you get through, your hair changes color, her changes color, you get to the middle, and sort of the past and the future become blurrier and blurrier. And you're sort of moving through, life. And you get older, your hair starts falling out, her hair turns gray, and there's no VO, there's no dialogue, there's no nothing. This is, you might as well be playing it, this is it. There's a song that I'm not going to hum, but that's it. And so you start moving through the world, and you get to the end and you become a really, really old couple. And at this point, it's kind of hard to tell on this screen, but basically the past becomes blurry, and it's sort of like you're near the end of your life. That part's crystal clear because there's not a lot of options when you're really old. You kind of know where you're going and you know where you've been, and the further back the past gets, the blurrier it gets. And then one of the just saddest things that will ever happen to you in a video game happens. She passes away and just turns into a tombstone. And that's it. She just turns into a tombstone. There's no cutscene, there's nothing. And they do one of the most, they being the one guy who made the game, this guy Jason Rohrer, Chain World guy, if anybody paid attention to GDC. But you basically turn into this sad old man. You get hunched over, and it does the most powerful thing, of any game I've played in 5 years. It simply cuts your movement speed in half. So she turns into a tombstone, and you hunch over like this, and you're walking across the screen like this. And that conveys more sadness and more of the emotion of that moment than, you know, any like life or death decision in Mass Effect or whatever. And I pick on Mass Effect because I like that game, so I'm not dogging it. Yeah, you turn into this old man. You're slouched over. Your hair's falling out. Her tombstone, as you can see, just gets mixed into the blurry past again. And at the end, you die, and that's it. That's the game. And when you're playing it, there's so little to do. There's actually like treasure you can collect, but it doesn't affect your score in any way. Which again, you know, read into that what you want to. As you're playing through the game, you start thinking. Like, it probably takes from the time you meet the girl till you start getting to the end. It's probably like maybe 3 minutes of real life time, and the whole time you're just watching these people go through life. And there's something about it that makes you start to think about your own relationships. And you know, I happen to be married, so I've thinking about like my little girl from the game, and it makes you start to contemplate that stuff. And you're just looking at these little girl, and you decide you don't want to have a partner in life. You're only verb is movement, so you just walk around her, and you just walk past her, and you go through the game yourself. And the same kind of thing happens. Your hair falls out. You move from one side of the screen to the other. Things get blurry and stuff like that. And you get to the end, and you die alone. You notice that there's half as many steps there, so you don't live as long. You never turn into the sad old man. You just kind of go from moderately gray-haired guy to tombstone. And that's it. And it kind of says, like, if you play it 2 times in a row, you're like, wow, what would my life, look how empty my life is without a partner. And it's like a really powerful statement, and like this is the whole game. So it's really amazing. It uses the movement and some very, very simple concepts to convey a very powerful message. It's going to be personal to every person who plays it, and I really encourage you. It's on every platform imaginable, iPhone, PC, Mac, whatever. So I'd encourage you to play it. It's a really powerful game. So let's quantify that against the list of things we just talked about. For VO, there's none. Custom writing, there's no dialogue. I mean, there's the title of the game, but that's it. For models, I counted 5. There's the man, the woman, the middle-aged man, the old man, and the tombstone. I'm being generous in calling the tombstone a model. Animation, there's 3. There's the man, the woman, and the old man. And then environments, there's one very low-fidelity environment that encapsulates the entire game. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that Passage is acceptable AAA quality for games. I just use that to show how low you can go in these areas of fidelity and still convey a very powerful message. So let's go back to the AAA world and talk about the different elements and kind of break them apart from being tied together in one scene and talk about them individually, because I think there's a lot of ways that you can use these more efficiently while still conveying the power of a AAA experience without making them all so expensive and tied together that you're limiting the number of things you can give the player. So the first one, VO. One key here is just try to isolate it. VO doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a cutscene that has lip sync and custom animation. You have to go to a sound stage or mocap stage and do the whole thing. Like, there's lots of games that have players talk to you on a radio, or you have an earpiece, or you hear someone calling from across the room, or any way to like sort of take that same VO, that same human connection that you want to put in a AAA game, and just try to think if there's ways you can give that to the player without all the attendant costs of a super expensive cutscene that takes a strike team of 8 people 1 milestone to build. Same thing with custom writing. First off, if you can systematize it so that you're not looking at like a deterministic number of scenes and writing specific dialogues, if you can genericize it just a little bit, I'm not saying take the flavor out of the characters or make it boring, but simply go through the list of emotions that the other characters in the game could have: happiness, sadness, surprise, betrayal, like all the different things that are going to be unique to your game, and simply systematize them so the game can have sort of like a big bucket of responses, and whenever the player does something, it picks the right one and plays it for the player. And again, even if players can identify that these are very sort of less specific comments, it still means a lot to them because they're happening at the right time based on what the player did, and it still feels like the game is talking to you and like you're making a difference. My favorite example of that is, anybody played System Shock 2? System Shock 2 fans? Like 1, 2? Good. So your reward in the game is, they're called cybernetic modules. It's basically your experience points or level up or whatever. And you can tell that they basically recorded like 3 or 4 different lines for, hey, good job, here's some cybernetic modules that they just cycle between. And every time you do something, complete a quest or find a hidden object or whatever, you get that same line, and you quickly recognize that it's the same lines used over and over. But you don't care, because you're like, yes, the game recognized when I did something. And that, again, that drop in fidelity, which is fairly small, gives you a lot on the player expression point. So Also try to isolate custom writing if you can. Can you take some thoughts from your game and have players read them in emails? Does your game have computers or books where you can convey this information? Let the writing just stand alone, you know? Do the writing to describe your world and convey the emotions you want, but just try to, again, isolate it from the cutscene, the VO, blah, 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 and think of cool ways to use it in creative ways. The last one here is environments, and if you can reuse your environments, there's sort of two benefits to this. One, if you are setting your cutscenes or your story moments or whatever you want to call them in the same environments where the gameplay is happening, you can simply spend more time building game-relevant environments, so that's good because you just have more space to play around or, you know, make it look better instead of building a ton of stuff that looks kind of bad. You can build a smaller space and kind of scale it to your project's needs. But even more than that and more subtle is the fact that a lot of games will create sort of hero environments where it's like, oh, this cutscene, like we really composed this shot that like has all the perfect camera angle and extra specular on that one pipe and all that kind of stuff like that. And when the player sees that kind of thing, it's a subtle reminder that like, oh, the cutscene's the important stuff. This is where they spent their money. This is where they put in the really cool stuff. And the rest of the game world is kind of lower fidelity and a little bit less important. It's like a subtle message that's just kind of unpleasant. So modeling, use restraint, which is basically if a story character is only there for story, then either see if you can get away with not having to model that character. Either have them talk to the player, on the phone or through a data link or on a radio, or figure out a cool like comic book cutscene style where you can use hand-drawn versions of the character or whatever. Like be creative so that you can spend that modeling time on gameplay relevant stuff, more enemies or more friendly characters or whatever. Animation is kind of the same thing, goes hand in hand with that restraint, which is basically if you're doing less only story animation, there's more time you can spend on your game. So each of these elements, when used sort of more efficiently and more creative ways, can allow you to create, allow for more opportunities for the player. The idea is basically building enough of this stuff that it can be reactive to what the player is doing instead of building a bunch of custom stuff you have to funnel the player through because of that whole, I'm sure you've heard producers say, well, we spent all the money on it, every player's got to see this. And it's like, well, that doesn't matter. The audience doesn't care what you spent the money on or how hard it was to make. They just care about the experience you're giving them. So one thing when I talk about all these points is it kind of sounds like I'm saying, like, just do worse versions of everything. Just be cheaper and don't do as much and make your game crappier. Which is not the case at all. I think that if you look at this from a creative perspective and think about how you can employ methods that make your game actually more unique, it can actually help you. So what you want to do is make your decisions and own your choices and make it into a stylistic choice that actually sets your game apart. A really good example of that is the intro movie from the game Infamous, so I'll play that.
While sliding into unconsciousness, I could somehow, I don't know, hear the voices of the dying. Thousands crushed by falling buildings, burned alive in the fires. Trish lost her sister, almost lost me. Zeke was always there, somehow sure that I'd wake up, while outside the city fell apart.
So that's an example of, that's from a big, awesome AAA Sony exclusive game. And that was a cutscene that wasn't, they could have acted all that out and built that whole thing, but instead they chose this cool comic book style. And they conveyed a lot of information in 30 seconds there. They gave you the timeline, this is the beginning of the game. They said, the hero got somehow imbued with these mysterious electrical powers. Something's happening in the city and people are being killed and crushed by some, awful cataclysm. The guy's got a girlfriend who lost her sister. He's in a hospital. He's got this best friend who's loyal to him. Like, that's a lot of information conveyed in 30 seconds. And the cool thing is, they did it in a stylish, unique way. Like, when I was a player, I watched and I was like, oh, wow, these guys have, like, their own storytelling voice. Like, that's I'll actually pay attention to this because it's actually interesting. It's not another freaking cutscene. It actually draws you in, and yet it's also way cheaper because, again, they isolated the VO. They just made a voiceover. They didn't model or animate anything. This is 2D drawings, but it's stylized and cool. So that's just an example. Think about ways to be more efficient while also making it your own, because I think that there's a lot of cool ideas there if you sort of don't assume that everything has to be this super arms race type fidelity for everything. And by the way, one last thing on that slide is that you can kind of imagine how if you had all those assets of drawings of people and backdrops and stuff like that, you could actually create like a really cool, more dynamic story actually by just combining those events in real time if you had like a cutscene controller type code thing. That sounds so technical. Code thing. Just make a code thing in your game to make it cooler. I'm a designer, sorry. even though I'm trying to learn programming. So Portal's another game that uses very cool storytelling methods. Again, isolated VO, environmental storytelling, which is really economical. You don't actually build the entire scene, you just show the remnants and let the player puzzle it out, and it actually can draw the player in more than if you just show them a interactive scene. That's not true in every case, but it is cool. Environmental storytelling. There's a really good talk that Matthias and Harvey Smith did, I think last year or 2 years ago, on environmental storytelling. It's a very powerful tool. And again, it's cheaper, but it's also more creative and interesting. You actually do cooler stuff with it a lot of the time. So in Portal, the gameplay was the story of the game. Like in the story, you're this character trying to escape a facility, a test facility, using these really, this cool portal mechanic that they came up with. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this. But that's also what you're doing in every level. So what you were doing in a moment-to-moment gameplay of, like, let me escape this room, was feeding into let me escape this facility, because the facilities contained, made up of a bunch of rooms. So basically, the language of the gameplay was the language of the narrative. So there's a nice unity there. And they had a specific scene with the weighted companion. Did anybody play this far in Portal? Anybody? It's a good show of hands right there. It's basically a level that's like any other, except for instead of you usually use all these anonymous crates to solve puzzles, but in here they give you a crate. It's the exact same crate, it just has a heart on it, and they tell you it's your weighted companion cube, and they make you carry that cube through all the whole level. It's one of the longer levels in the game to solve all the puzzles, and you sort of build this weird attachment to it, which is odd because it's a cube. That's it. It doesn't talk. There's nothing. But the player again reads into this type of stuff and develops an attachment, and so. By the end of the level, the main sort of antagonist character of the game makes you kill your companion cube, and it's oddly difficult to do. It's oddly emotionally difficult. You just hit a button mechanically, but emotionally you're like, oh, but that's my companion cube, and it's a cube, man. That's not that's all it is. Like there's no. It's amazing how much emotion they got into that with a little bit of VO and a custom texture. Now, and again, it's not an example of a player-driven story, because ultimately it was filtered back into a linear narrative where you had to kill. You didn't have a choice about it. But again, it's a good example of, in a big, successful AAA game, how with very economical, very simple techniques, you can create a little narrative that means something to players, and you can imagine how they could extend that into a player-driven story. It simply just wasn't a goal of that project. The guys at Valve are badass, so if they decide they want to solve that problem, they'd solve it. So it wasn't a goal of that project, so I'm not necessarily knocking it for that, but it just does demonstrate, again, very simple, very efficient techniques. You can do a lot if you're just a little bit creative with it. And the other thing I really like about Portal is kind of what I was pointing out, is that competence is the narrative. Like, you being good at solving those puzzles is you being good at the narrative of the game. Those things are so closely linked that you feel a real strong sense of identity with the narrative of the game. So if we talk about story-relevant competence with Portal and unified agency, and talked about some ways we can bring the fidelity down to bring the agency up. And if you do all that stuff, you can start to create emergent story outcomes without a huge content burden. But those things are good, but we haven't talked about relatedness yet, and we'll get there a little bit. But the idea of that agency and the competence talking to each other, it kind of comes to the idea that the gameplay and the narrative of the game, I believe, should both be expressed as systems that touch each other, as opposed to having this hard shift between certain type of gameplay and then watching a cutscene, or having completely different interactions in the cutscenes or story that you don't have when you're playing the game. So if you can implement your narrative and gameplay at the same level through the same systems, then players begin to see those things as one, as opposed to, again, having that feeling that they're jumping back and forth between playing and watching. If they're just interacting at all times, and those narrative systems actually have gameplay impact and vice versa, you can start to blend these things together. So I'll do some examples of that, because I know that sounds a little bit hand-wavy. But the idea is that there's just no rift in fidelity between those things, to the point that the players just simply see the game as one experience and kind of take it all in at once. So one good example of this is a conversation system in games. And the ones that I think have been used best are the ones that not only let you do narrative kind of discussions with characters, but are also used for things like bartering with characters, or buying items from characters, or a lot of gameplay relevant type stuff, or bribing someone to get through a door instead of having to pick the lock or kill the guy or whatever. Like, whenever you have a narrative conversation system that also has gameplay utility, then the player stops thinking about that divide so much, because he's like, this is just a game where I just talk to people sometimes, and sometimes I talk to them for gameplay, sometimes I talk to them to get story, but either way, it's just how the game works. And so it kind of breaks down those barriers and also lets you, again, express the mechanics and the narrative in the same type of voice. Another one is in World of Warcraft. One nice thing, one kind of cool thing they do there is, it's a MMO, so you kill things and loot them. That's, kill, loot, kill, loot, kill, loot. That's the cycle. And normally whenever you get quests, you go talk to a character and you get a quest pop up and blah, blah, blah. But every now and then you'll loot a monster and find a note in its pocket. And you're like, oh, well, let me click and loot and, oh, let me open that up. Ooh, I can read this thing. Oh, there's some mysterious event. And, oh, I can accept the quest. And it turns into a quest. And it's like a little way that the gameplay and the narrative were tied more so than, let me go talk to this guy with a, exclamation point over his head and get a quest and blah, blah, blah. They brought that narrative delivery into the gameplay a little bit more through a repetitive action that the player does all the time. And it always feels a little cooler to get a quest that way because you feel like I'm out in the world and because I killed that guy and because I checked him and went through his pockets, quote unquote, I found something interesting that's unique to me. Like somebody wasn't waiting around to stand there to tell me that. Like that's actually a cooler way to get a quest in that game. And then the last example is just any game that has hacking systems. So Deus Ex or Mass Effect, System Shock, any kind of game that has computer hacking. That's another one that can be used for both gameplay and narrative purposes. Obviously, you can hack into a computer to switch some turrets or shut off a camera or do all that kind of stuff in Fallout. Or you can read biographical information on characters or read their emails or whatever. But again, it's the kind of thing where the player sees a computer and he's like, oh, I hacked those. And I get different benefits either time. Sometimes I do it for gameplay, sometimes I do it for story, but it's just how the game works. And so that's the goal, is really trying to unify everything into players just simply interacting with the game itself and not thinking so much about that divide between games and story. And I want to take a quick detour here because I know that I'm talking about genericizing VO and systems and it sounds like I'm just like Mr. Drain the character out of everything. And that's not at all what I'm about. I think we actually should be creating really cool, vibrant worlds with interesting characters and stuff like that. My point is just saying that let's not prescribe this. Let's not create a whole world and then tell the player he can only have one path through it. Let's create these awesome worlds that are full of personality and totally unique to your vision, and just let the player I want to walk around all those corners. I don't want to only talk to one guy and do the one thing. I want to explore a world. So basically trying to say let's make games that are a little bit more like that, and let's put all of our creativity into them. But let's just come at it from a slightly different angle so that we're offering more to the player. I just want to diffuse any ideas that I'm just trying to make everything as bland as possible because I think that if we do this stuff right, we can actually make things way more interesting because the player is touching it more richly. So I want to use an example from Deus Ex, which is my favorite game of all time. And this is just an example of how that sort of gameplay systems and narrative systems touching each other to create a really interesting and powerful choice in the game. So this is the scene where this is your brother Paul. He's just the main character's brother because that's how the story's set up. And you go to visit him in his apartment, and all of a sudden the bad guys show up at the door, and they're like, "Hey, come out! We're here to arrest you!" Blah blah blah. And it's like a big, sort of twist moment in the game. And so you're like, "Hey man, we got to get out of here." And your brother's like, "Go without me. I'm too sick." And you're like, "I'm not leaving you." And he's like, "Go, save yourself." And you're like, "No." And then the guys bust in, and you get in this fight. He gets up from his chair, and at this point he's just an AI, like every other AI in the game. You didn't make any choices in conversation. It's just like the game puts you in this situation and you decide how to deal with it. So this fight starts and you've got some choices. If you run out the window like a coward and just escape and leave him to his fate, in the next level you find him dead. And you realize, wow, because I bailed on him, he died. It's like, man, that's kind of hard. When that happened to me, I actually got up from the computer and went and told my girlfriend. I was like, "They killed my brother." That's actually what I was talking about because I've been raving about this game or whatever. But it was very powerful. But let's run back the clock a second, and let's say same moment you decide I'm gonna be brave. I'm gonna be strong. I'm gonna defeat this thing. You go out and you fight alongside your brother. You fight your way out of the hotel, get to the next level, and in the exact same spot you find him alive. And it's interesting to me because it's a fairly standard example of branching in games, but it wasn't a branch that was like press X to do this or B to do that or a single conversation choice. It was expressed through the mechanics of the game. It was expressed. There was a combat scene. You had your basic navigation, the conversation system, which in this game again had mechanical and narrative purpose. So when you're talking to them, sometimes you talk to people to buy stuff and et cetera, et cetera. So you never saw that as purely a story scene or purely a gameplay scene. It was just like, wow, these are events that occurred. I made decisions in the gameplay, and they had repercussions. And basically, your brother lived or died based on your actions in that pivotal scene. Again, it's not a good example of a player-driven story because ultimately that was a short loop that got closed off, and whether he lives or dies, the story kind of plays out the same. But it's a good example of how to use these mechanical systems to express moments and let the player make those cool decisions, and then feed all that stuff back in the same mechanics. So like you find his body in the next level by hacking and sneaking your way through a private facility, which is what you do in that game anyways. So yeah, it ultimately wasn't a player-driven story, but it's a good example. Another example that I want to talk about is Red Dead Redemption, which this is probably the biggest spoiler here. So if you haven't played this, I feel for you because it's an awesome game, but you might want to just cover your ears. I specifically want to talk about the Deadeye mechanic because a lot of the game's most poignant moments were actually, even though it's a very cutscene heavy game, they were expressed in gameplay. So later in the game, you go hunting with your son, and it's not a cutscene. You actually go out, and there's a hunting mechanic in the game, and you just go hunt with him, and you're like, wow, he's here with me, and we're hunting, and it's just how the game works, and that's really powerful, and you actually start to develop a relationship. It's a really nice scene. The Deadeye mechanic is critical to another scene, so quick explanation of that. It's just a bullet time type mechanic, but I'll just show a quick use of it here.
Experienced players can place the shots individually to devastating effect.
So basically it's like a gunslinging bullet time mechanic where you can slow down time, pick 3, 4, maybe 5 guys to shoot, and then unslow it and bang, 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 take them down like gunslinger style. Makes sense. It's a Western game, so that's perfectly good mechanic. But it comes into play at the end of the game in a way that is very, very powerful, because by the time you see this scene in the game, you've gone into Deadeye hundreds of times. You know exactly what the mechanic's capable of. You know that you can kill probably 4 or 5 characters before time speeds up and the guys start shooting at you, so you're very, very familiar with it. And this is the sort of final scene for John Marston. He's just sent his family to safety, and he's sort of at his Waterloo moment. He's sort of cornered, and all the federal marshals are there to get him, and so this is how the scene plays out. So that scene was basically like 90% cutscene and 10% gameplay. But when you played the game up to that point and you were that familiar with that mechanic, and it forces you into that mechanic in that moment, and you look and see 20 people, and you know you can only kill 5 of them, it connects with you on a visceral level, because you're not watching a cutscene of a guy getting shot down. You're like, oh, I can't take these guys. I can't, like you identify so personally because you're so familiar with that mechanic that it makes the scene 10 times as powerful. So it really connects right to the player as opposed to the story character, and just has an emotional impact that's just amazing because it's just visceral. You look at it and you say, oh my god, I can't handle this, oh, boom, and you're dead. And it just connects with you so much more than if they'd had this beautifully, cinematic a cutscene where you watch the thing happen. So you were doomed along with him. You weren't just watching him die, you were with him in that moment. And it's incredibly powerful. Even in a very strongly structured linear narrative game, there's still ways that you can use your game mechanics to make a point even more strongly. So that's one of my favorite examples of that. So to wrap up the discussion of sort of agency, fidelity, and competence, I want to read a quote by my friend JP LeBreton, who worked with me on Bioshock 2. He was on Bioshock 1. He works at Double Fine now. And one of the smartest dudes you'll ever meet talking about games. And this is from a retrospective article he wrote about Deus Ex last year on the 10th year anniversary. And this is just one snippet from it, but I love this quote. It says, the capitalized word that comes to me now is fidelity. I ponder how incredibly difficult it would be to make a game like Deus Ex for a major publisher today. Reasonably advanced for 2000, today it's clear that DX's simple environments and primitive people enabled both its scope and its depth. Our standards have risen in some ways, but are they unequivocally the right ways? And that really is the question that I would ask everybody, because you know, when you look back, there's a lot of goofy stuff in Deus Ex. The voice acting is actually kind of bad. The character models are pretty ugly. The graphics aren't very good. But none of that stuff matters because it's all consistent within the game, and you still have a very strong emotional experience, and that fidelity doesn't really detract. And I'm not saying ship a game that looks that bad now, but you can definitely get away with a lot less fidelity whenever you're giving a lot more agency to the player and letting them connect more with your subject matter. And so just think about those things. Think about how efficient you can be with all of your delivery methods for story. DX's fidelity was more than good enough to express the story of that game, and you know, I guess what I want to leave you with from this section of the talk is just let the player be as expressive as possible, and don't just assume that everything you has to do has to compete with the polished level of a Call of Duty or some really huge quadruple A game. So that covers mechanics, but if we have unified agency at a manageable level of fidelity and allow the player's competence to contribute to the narrative, what do we have? Well, we're not quite there because we still need to think about that last point, relatedness. And without relatedness, I think we have a different problem, which is system soup, which basically means that if you've got a bunch of interactions and the game's highly reactive to what you're doing and you give the player a lot of agency and it's like his sandbox, if that's where you stop, then it's just a toy. There's no long-term meaning, there's no investment, there's no sort of long tail of narrative in the game. A good story, as we know, like humans are born to tell and understand and parse stories. It's just something that's wired into us, and we know about the peaks and the valleys and the surprises and all the things that happen in a good story. So we need to take all this agency that we've given the player and somehow shape it into a story that's unique to them, but also is identifiable as a story. So how do we solve that? We have to look at that chaos and turn it into order. But what kind of order are we looking for? What has meaning? That's a big question for us. So basically, and I'll go into detail about all this, but what you really have to do is create a game that can understand the player's actions and key interactions and comprehend the meaning behind those and start to understand those actions in a way that can be turned into things like turning points or major story beats, like the death of a lover, parting with a friend, leaving home, having your life saved by a friend, all the things that go into the big moments of a really good story. But how do we do that? We basically have to discern meaning from the player's actions and figure out, and this is a big part of the wicked problem thing, because like this is going to be unique to every game, because every game has different interactions and a different fictional context. So this is a decision you really have to make for your own game, like what matters. And this is very unique to every game, so there's no one answer here. But it's basically the idea that whatever interactions you're allowing, you know which ones matter and which ones don't, and so you listen to them. Listen to them be recording in code and in data what the player's doing, and then start to interpret that over time. So this is a really, really simple example. I've actually since then been working on some stuff that's much more complex than this, but this is good for a presentation. But basically, if you have this simple graph that's good on one side, evil on the other side, and 0 doesn't matter, and 10 is, oh my god, the biggest possible supernova thing you could do in the story. Start to plot some points on there and talk about what they are, to try to talk about how the game can start to understand these things, both the sort of the alignment of the event and the amplitude of it. So to use some examples, first one is giving a homeless guy food. It's a nice thing to do, but it's only a 2 because he probably doesn't have much to do with your story about overthrowing the emperor or whatever. So it's that kind of averages out to a fairly small event in the game. Snubbing the mayor, it's not that mean of a thing to do, if you snub him at a party, but he's the mayor, so it kind of matters more, so maybe that's a 5 on that scale, so you kind of understand that even though it's a small thing, it happened to a big character. Killing a dictator, super awesome thing, because dictators suck, and it made millions of people's lives miserable, and since he's the main guy who's causing all that, hopefully it brings change to the land of your game world or whatever, and so it's a very, very important event. And then the last one is killing your best friend, which is sort of the evil version of that, because you would assume that your best friend is a relationship that's been built up over years, maybe decades, and to suddenly kill them, huge amplitude event. That's a really big deal. So you have to understand the qualitative value and the quantitative impact of an event. So if you can now start to listen to the game, start to record what the player's doing, and understand the meaning of those interactions, you can start to track those things and learn about them. And the key here is tracking them over time, so that you can say, like, oh, if you heal this character a bunch of times, they become your friend. Or if you punch this character a bunch of times, I'm using very simple examples, but whatever the verbs are in your game, you can start to, instead of just tracking them as singular events, you start tracking how the player behaves over time, and modifying that into relationship data. Because once the game understands what the relationships are and how powerful those relationships are, the game knows how to react in kind, and knows how to feed those things back and play back at the player and make the player feel like he's really taking part in a real narrative that's unique to him. So what's an example of a game that kind of does what I'm talking about? Because this is actually, this is one of the biggest solved problems of the talk. If you look at strategy games, and this is Civilization 5, strategy games are sort of based on everything we're talking about. Because you've got a bunch of entities that can be players or AIs that have all the same verbs, i.e. unified agency. Like you can do everything the AI can do and vice versa. You're picking from the same pool of powers and looking at the map the same way. And they track those relationships over time. So like if you've ever played Civ, you know that if you sign a peace treaty and then attack them anyways, the next time you go to sign a peace treaty, the guy's like, no, you backstabbed me and I'm not going to sign that again because I hate you and we're still at war. And it's like, wow, yeah, that guy's reacting in a proper way because of what I did. And that wasn't any kind of storyline event. It was simply the game understanding a peace treaty is one thing, violating it is another thing. So it was a very high amplitude event, so to speak. So strategy games are kind of based on all this stuff just working, and under the hood they do a lot of tracking on this type of stuff, and it's actually a solved problem. Now, it's not very emotionally compelling because we're not dealing with characters. You're looking at this removed view, and in Civilization, Civilization leaders are very sort of cartoonish characters and whatnot. And those are all those little men. You don't know what those dudes' names are, just that they're gonna probably die. So it's not, it doesn't have that emotional connection, but it does have that sort of back-end database, so to speak, of relationships and story that you've built uniquely per game. So it really comes down to taking the sort of solved problem of tracking this relationship data and then applying it back to more emotional context in games that have a little bit more of a connection with one-on-one relationships and stuff like that. So this is very, 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 very closely tied to manageable fidelity, because you basically have to say, we've got all this data, how can we represent it in a way that allows for the most sort of outcomes? So I think of it sort of like as a game controller sitting at a switchboard and kind of listening to what the player's doing and plugging in the right reaction, and it's not a series of branches. You're not going through a series of designer-authored points, but you're actually listening and saying, oh, the player did this, okay, connect it to this response, this VO or this gameplay event or whatever's unique to your game. Again, this is the wicked problem thing. Like, it's kind of hard to speak to specifics because this can be different for every game. But basically the game listening to what the player's doing and feeding back in the right ways. And this is, again, significantly different than branching, because branching is just a bunch of authored points. This is actually the game listening and waiting for the player to do something and reacting appropriately. So that's a pretty big difference. And if you can have as much specificity as you can afford with your systematized reactions, and that really means something to the player, because again, you get to the point where the player does something, the game listens, the game understands it and can feed back with an appropriate reaction. That's a very powerful thing when that happens. So that's kind of the beauty of agency and emergence, and there's lots of examples of how you could do this if your game has any way for characters to communicate with you cheaply, be it emails or radio calls or phone calls like in GTA or whatever. Then you can record a lot of stuff for fairly cheap because you're not building cutscenes for every single thing, and then you can just call up the right one whenever the player does something, and hopefully in your game there's ways that you can figure out how to feed back things to the player cheaply enough to allow for many more opportunities for the player, many more outcomes. So that's a solved problem, the relationship tracking side of things. We just have to apply the known solutions to new territory from a presentation standpoint so that we can actually feed that back to the player in more traditional, character-driven action/RPG type games. But does that create a narrative? Not quite. There's one last piece, and I promise we're getting to the end because I know this is kind of going long. But the last piece here is basically figuring out what is a story, and this is a pretty simple example. This is the 3-act structure. It's just simply the dramatic tension rising and falling over time. This is a perfectly good example of a good story. It's proven, and you can obviously twist it and turn it and do all kinds of more interesting things to it. But it's a good working example for this, because basically you can say if time is hey, we're trying to make an 8-hour game and we want big events to happen on a certain timeline to create what people will identify as a good story, then you can start to track things and maybe at this event, you're like, wow, we want to take, the relationship the player has invested the most in. Okay, let me look at the database and say, okay, cool, he's made the strongest friendship with this guy, and have that guy turn on the player, or have him get killed by the enemy, or whatever, and basically take the data you've been listening to and, push it on just a schedule. It's not that we're predetermining what's going to happen because it's going to be different for every player. But basically, make those events happen on a timeline that allows the player to, basically. Sorry, can you turn off the flash?
Sure.
It's kind of.
Sure, sorry.
Yeah, no, you can record it. It's just the flash is kind of. Yeah, but anyways, on a timeline, allow the player, allow the game to inject these events in a way the player recognizes. So basically, what you want to do here is you want to create moments. So if you look at Jaws, this is a very good simple example. You've got Chief Brody, you've got Quint, and you got this shark that's eating people, and so they go out to try to kill the shark, and it's basically a story about three characters. Hooper's kind of irrelevant to the story, and I don't like Richard Dreyfuss that much. So you have events like this is the first time you see the shark, and it's like that's one of the little spikes. It's not the big moment, but then you have bigger moments like when Quint gets eaten. That's kind of gruesome. And then finally, at the end, you have the big showdown, and that's kind of a good example of a fairly simple story that you could imagine being very systemic, which is like you've got two characters versus a third character, and on a certain timeline, you say, okay, we're gonna have a minor attack. Oh, then we're gonna have a big attack. Oh, then we're gonna kill Quint. And you can see how that would actually play out. So what you want to do is basically have this timeline, inject these events appropriately, and then force the player to make choices. You don't care what the outcome is. You just want to put the player in a situation where they have to make a choice for that dramatic impact. And the cool thing about doing this is those moments are the best time to listen to what the player does and build that relationship data. Because, like in Deus Ex, if you run, you're like, oh, the player's a coward. If you stand and fight with your brother, it's like, oh, the player's brave. And that helps those relationships. Running ruins your relationship with your brother, so to speak. Fighting with them strengthens that relationship. So you're getting more data. So this is actually a really good time to try to learn more about the player so that the next event you try to trigger is even more powerful. An example of this, the first one from a game that I worked on, as did Yonaman. He's down there. Cool. Basically, in Bioshock 2, there was these characters called the Big Sister, and the Big Sister was sort of the biggest boss of the game. And there were also characters called Little Sisters, who were these characters that you would basically you could pick up and you could deal with them in different ways. You could kill them, you could save them, you could use them to gather resources. And the Big Sisters sort of cared about how you dealt with the Little Sisters. And so that was sort of on the gameplay level, but on a narrative level, the Big Sisters were Little Sisters who had grown up, and there was also a main antagonist character who was controlling the Big Sisters and sending them after you as a player. So you sort of have a strong thematic tie between the characters and also gameplay ties. So how we did that in terms of having that kind of schedule type story is that we started listening to how you dealt with the Little Sisters, and we started assigning point values, like I was describing on that other screen. And it was basically like, if you save a Little Sister, you get a certain amount of points. If you kill a Little Sister, that's really bad, so you get a different number of points. And we basically just rated what the different interactions were, and then we said, well, the Big Sister should attack the player about so many times in the game. So we'll start listening, and once the player gets to 5 points, or I can't remember what the tuning numbers were, but once it gets to 5 points, we trigger an attack, and then at 12 points, we trigger a bigger attack, and basically started having the Big Sisters attack the player based on how the player was dealing with the Little Sisters. And it was completely player-driven, to the point that it's not like in every level we had like a Big Sister battle arena. We did a tremendous amount of work in the game to make sure that the Big Sister could attack the player anywhere at any time. Some players got attacked in the middle of other boss fights, which kind of sucks for them, but it would happen, and get attacked in really awkward places, and Big Sister would hunt you down in the level no matter what. And it was basically the idea that if the player felt like what he was doing in that moment, and for that reason, was listened to and reacted to by the game, that was a story about them. It's like, oh my God, surely they didn't see me, shoot that Little Sister when no one was looking, but oh my God, the Big Sister's coming. It's like, it's different for every player. And so we basically had a schedule in the game of how often we wanted these events to happen. We listened to how the player was interacting with these other key story characters, and then we created these sort of roving boss battles that could happen anywhere at any time, that really just fed back, what the player was doing. Now, again, like most of these examples, was not a fully player-driven story because you couldn't, for example, be so nice to the Little Sisters that the Big Sisters stop attacking you, or whatever. So it was kind of a half solution, but it did demonstrate that if you do enough work, you can make the game really highly reactive to what the player's doing, and basically respond to his actions instead of having be on the a sort of roller coaster ride where everybody gets that same experience. So it was successful for us, but we could have taken it further if it had really been a goal to make that story fully dynamic. So that's pretty much the end. I'll do a quick recap. So the thing I want to leave you with is game stories aren't taking advantage of interactivity. We're copying other mediums and telling linear stories that the audience isn't contributing to. We should be creating stories in which the player makes influential decisions that create unique narratives that are not prescribed by a designer. And if we want to use the interactivity that's unique to our medium and look at what people want and apply those desires to our goal, then we can start letting players affect every part of the worlds that we're creating for them. And if we've got to stand down from the arms race to fidelity that's sort of undermining our medium, and instead look at how we can use the tools at our disposal in smarter and more efficient ways that allow us to give players more agency and more ownership over their own experiences. And if we can own our choices and create systems that allow our gameplay to communicate seamlessly with our narratives, then we can start to understand what the player's actions mean. And from that data, we can build relationships. These are relationships that we can manipulate in ways that form a cohesive narrative full of moments that mean something to players based on their own actions. And if we can do those things, then we can start to create stories that are unique to only our medium, and players will make those stories their own. And if we as developers can get out of our own way and create worlds in which we're asking the players to be the authors, then we really do have a chance to create meaningful player-driven stories. Thank you very much. So you can download the slides there, and I don't know if anybody has questions or comments or snide remarks. But
Yeah, so maybe we have a few minutes. For
uh-oh, Zerx, what's up, dog? He
Well,
also
I
works on
agree
Project Activity. He
with
snuck
pretty
in
much
there.
everything you're saying,
Okay.
and I would like to see us as a industry strive towards these goals. But a lot of building narrative off of giving players maximum player expression derives from building the narrative and the gameplay and systems in parallel. Do you have any thoughts on best practices for working production models for games that are of our era?
Sure. I think one of those, and this is something that they started to do in Ubisoft on Far Cry 2, which incorporated a lot of these elements. There's actually a lot more going on under the hood in Far Cry 2 that's not readable, that's kind of a missed opportunity, which is kind of sad because there's a lot more dynamism there than I think people realize. But one of the things they did was they basically, instead of having the traditional model of, hey, we've got a writer, and a writer's just going to go off and write a story, and we're going to parse this into a big Excel sheet of animations and cutscene lines, stuff like that. They have a narrative designer who's sort of a middle ground there, who actually works with the game designer / creative director type person from the outset of the game. And so instead of saying, oh, we're going to make some cool shooting mechanics over here, and then you're going to write this story, and we're just going to put them together at some point, having those people develop those ideas together from the start allows you to say, well, okay, we're going to make a story about love and loss, or whatever you want to say. Say, well, how do we create mechanics that allow those emotions to happen naturally? Okay, how do we create, set up characters that are waiting to react, as opposed to what linear story do we want to tell the player? So I think really it comes down from making it a project goal, and then hiring people in who are owning both the gameplay and the narrative, and having them together at the beginning to say, well, if I want to do this narratively, what do you have game design wise? Oh, actually, well, we're doing this, so let's tweak that, and basically just having that collaboration start from the beginning. And be a true collaboration and not necessarily be two different departments that just sort of talk together when they have to. That's kind of a high-level picture. But again, so much of this stuff is game-specific that it's hard to get into super low details. But beyond that, it's doing your game writing so that you do have reactions to things as opposed to, let me write this scene that you're just going to sit back and watch. Things like that. I'd actually be interested in your perspective as a dude who works on basically VO and dialogue recording. Your thoughts on if you think we can kind of do what I'm saying. By the way, this isn't a plant, so he might say no and invalidate a bunch of my talk. But do you think we can have convincing specificity with a little bit more generic lines, and so the game can react a little bit more? Do you think that's
yeah,
doable?
well, especially in systemic AI, it's something that I'm striving for is being able to tack more generic VO bank sets into AI reactions, just to be able to minimize the impact of specificity in AI reactions in game. Make the game a little less chatty and a little less directed, and also giving the player character more control over voicing that than to have the reactive elements being your informant as to what you're doing. But I think that as far as production models go, I agree with you. I believe that narrative design is something that needs to be implemented if we're going to start telling larger stories across larger environments and achieve the fidelity that we are as an industry tied to at this point. So yeah, I think it's doable. I also strongly advocate for no pro VO before alpha and sticking to strong alphas. But
yeah, that makes sense too. Back to David.
yes, we can.
What's up?
It seems to be, just from the stuff that you presented, that the game that sort of sprung to mind, the way of dealing with these problems and implemented a lot of the solutions that you mentioned was Fable, like the Fable series, and I was wondering if you had any comments on that series or examples of how that did this particularly well or poorly.
I'm kind of at a loss because I've never played one of the Fable games. Has anybody else played Fable? And have thoughts on that? Oh, I see a hand. You put your hand halfway up. You have to talk now.
Well, I played Fable, but as far as, I mean, according to the first one, it was a pretty linear narrative as far as I remember. That was years ago now. But I remember as they went, it was a lot of the branching. As you said, you'd make singular choices, and choices would dictate small-scale alterations, and then they would converge back again on a main storyline. And then I think with the third one, you had kind of two endings you could end up with, depending on how you played the game as a whole.
I think one of the options to look at this is to go a level up. I mean, look at things like what Will Wright did with Bar Carnival. Basically, they turned the shooting of a TV series on current TV into a game. Their story editor, like, I literally didn't watch the show series, but just loved playing the game. Of literally sitting there choosing, coming up with story cards, coming up with images to represent it, seeing who chose it and what story came off of that. And I think that's kind of the next level, especially if you look at the social gaming space and the mobile gaming space, where users contributing stuff, maybe building areas in a game world that will literally let you, once you build a base world, create the next level of really interactive transmedia, choose your own adventure MMOs. That's the stuff that, like you said, we add content, and that's cool to crowdsource because it saves production costs. But when you really turn over the story, or even make a competition between the DM and the people on the quests and the people who create elements in the game worlds that run those areas, that type of synergy is really interesting.
Yeah. And
content.
I think it's funny because I think that I think sort of highly authorial designers are scared by that, but I don't know. Get over it. Like,
yeah. I mean, like WoW. What WoW did that people didn't get was it turned grind into an area that had value in the game. Same thing with Second Life. Like, it turned grind into something that people not only have fun doing and have control over, but make money at.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just a big advocate of basically taking the authorial hands over the wheel. More like, you know, some of the stuff we talked about at work. We talked about some random prototypes that ended up not going anywhere because we kind of changed what our project was going to be. But we did some experiments where we had like QA guys. We had a game where we were playing. We had invented like a voting system and had people role playing stuff. And the way that I termed it was like, we're not making a game, we're making an SDK for human interactions. And it was more like, you kind of want to turn over a thing that let people, you know, that lets people be expressive and sort of like, here's your toy box, and it's going to listen, it's going to react as well as it can. And, you know, if other people want to mod it or crowdsource or whatever, then great, like let it become its own beast and just kind of create the toy box or create the toolbox and then turn it over. Because, like, I don't know, like...
I actually was talking to people, I was just thinking about this last week. What if you combined, like, the ability to have people with AR play a character, which they create the overlay, but it's actually their voice and actually stuff with some modding, and then you let them build a world with, like, something like Google SketchUp, the elements in the game, and then actually with mobile and some of the other tools you could do, and then monetize in the markets and the interactions, that's even better than, like, the best AI that you can write.
Sure.
And it costs you less.
You'd be surprised at how involved the user base gets as soon as UGC becomes a viable playing mechanic. I built a game as creative designer on like 5-6 years ago, and it was a simple kids game. And we didn't really expect to get too much generated out of it. It was a music-based kids game, so like kids would. I made a sequencer, basically a very kid-friendly, simple monophonic sequencer that kids could get into, and by the end of the first month, we had like I think like 50,000 uniques on that site, and we had about like a good 6,000 uploads of songs that kids were sharing with each other. And in the following month, it grew exponentially, and it kept going. And it was just like, this simple little tool. And as soon as you give UGC into the hands of the player, it's something that drives player expression in a way that core mechanics really even can't.
Yep.
So my question is, how important do you think it is for players to know that their choices are being influential? And to use your examples, taking a look at the Morrowind one, when you kill the guy, it gives you the message saying that the threads of the prophecy had been severed or something. Like it lets you know that big changes happened. In contrast to BioShock 2, when I played through that, I actually had no idea until you mentioned it that my treatment of the little sisters was influencing the behavior of the big sisters. I mean, obviously it affected my gameplay, but I had no clue.
Get out.
They just showed up on me, and I was like, "Oh, big sister time."
Yep. No, that's a very astute point or question, I guess. And it's when I was mentioning the stuff in Far Cry 2, like having talked to Clint a lot about what they did there. There's so much going on that I was the same way as a player. I was like, really, that determined that? I had no idea. And I think that that kind of proper feedback is absolutely critical. It's almost not worth doing the other work if the player doesn't recognize that they're the one who's making those decisions. So like, the BioShock example and the Far Cry 2 example of like a lot more going on under the hood than the player knew about. That's pretty much a failure of those games, and it's shooting yourself in the foot of doing all that work and then not letting the player know. Because I think it's very important for the player to simply understand, I did this, so now the game reacted that way. That's pretty core to it,
So I'm a bit ashamed to say this, but when I played Deus Ex, it was pretty much the same thing. I didn't realize till like a few years later when other people told me what happened in their game that all these choices had actually impacts. I thought, stuff is happening. That's great. It must be how it's scripted, but I didn't realize all these choices actually had an impact. I don't know if there's a good way to really highlight that this is important, but yet still maintain the illusion that the whole universe is seamless. I don't know.
It's a tough issue, but I think there's a lot of stuff to use the BioShock 2 example. I mean, we could have done a better job of just simply having more radios from the first couple of times that Big Sisters come, be like, sort of like a "you're asked for it" kind of line or whatever, just to let the player know. Because I think you can, there's nothing wrong with reinforcing why something happened. So I don't think that diminishes it.
I think we have
all kinds of hands.
I have one more question.
Oh man, now you pick. I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings.
Okay. Thanks. So this gentleman mentioned MMOs and the social space, and I thought it was really interesting because your talk has been very much about single-player games.
Yes.
And the interesting thing to me about MMO games is that you have all these players who have all the agency, and it's sort of what the games do is sort of provide this setting and kind of try to make it generic enough that everybody can kind of get into it, and hopefully, given the right factors, are able to connect with each other and form their own narrative. But how do you have any thoughts on how game designers can encourage more of that narrative to have a good game design as opposed to just, the players being in there talking to each other?
Sure, yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think probably the best example to look at for that one is if you look at WoW versus EVE Online, because EVE Online I think is probably the most successful case of what you're talking about, of like create an environment and then let the players run it. And like if you look at how that game shipped versus how it is now, and you start read a lot of these sort of online interviews and articles of people who have formed corporations and done corporate espionage and like all this stuff that the creators never intended, it's a fascinating world. Like it's also vicious and cruel and mean and awful, and I never want to play it, and super hardcore, but it is those things that you're talking about. And I think that I don't want to oversimplify, but if you just go back to the MDA thing, which is mechanics, dynamics, aesthetics, mechanics being the simple rules. I pull the trigger and a bullet goes out and a bullet does damage or whatever, and then dynamics, which is the interaction of how those different mechanics can come together and create new meaning. Then you basically should say, again, what kind of stuff do we want to encourage in our game? So maybe this is a game about friendship, or maybe this is a game about PvP, or maybe this is a game about people organizing into corporations or whatever. And so you say, well, if we want people to organize in corporations, we'll just create a new form of guild that people can just create and have a couple interactions. If you can buy stock in other guilds, right? I don't even know. Like I'm making up examples, but basically thinking about what you're trying to model and just put the mechanics there, and then let the dynamics sort themselves out. And again, in kind of in the same way that like I think there's actually a lot more connection between the single player and the MMO than might first seem, because on all the single player stuff, I'm basically saying, games with lots of other characters kind of already do all this stuff because humans have reactions, and so you're always having someone else react in kind to what you're doing. But so what I'm kind of saying is, let's try to make the AI characters in our game have a little bit more of those human responses and react in more believable ways. Whereas in MMOs, you've got the characters do that, but you're in both types. You're kind of creating the mechanics and the dynamics and sort of DMing or puppet mastering the kind of thing, or puppet mastering the events of the game in a way that shapes it in a certain direction. In the same way, like the EVE Online guys have changed the rules of the game many, many times when they saw where it was going. Like, oh, people are starting to do this? Okay, let's officially support it. And in this patch, we now have, buying stock in corporations or whatever. Like, that's probably, the specifics are probably wrong. But they've definitely listened to it and let it develop in a way that the characters took it, or the players took it, and support those type of things. But they only ever introduced mechanics, right? Like they said, if you can buy stock, then the players will say, well, now that I can buy stock, we're going to do a hostile takeover. And it's not like they made a hostile takeover mechanic. They just said, you can purchase something with in-game currency, and the players took it there. So I think it's really just about trying to create as many mechanics as you can that allow the type of dynamics that you want to start building. God, that was convoluted. Did that make sense at all?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Good.
Thanks
All right.
very much, and
Thanks for listening.
so we're gonna have food outside right now, and so if you guys want to go out and have some beer and hopefully take 2 minutes for a little while.